The frost came early to Ashbourne that October, and it found Eliza Whitmore already awake. She lay for a moment in the gray dark of the servants' attic, listening to the wind test the shutters, and told herself, as she told herself every morning, that cold was only cold. It could not follow her into the day. It could not follow her into the kitchens, where the fires were banked before dawn, or into the long gallery where she would spend the morning on her knees with a rag and a pail of water gone lukewarm before she reached the second window. She rose. She dressed by feel, not by light, because there was no light yet to speak of, and she folded her blanket with the same care she folded everything, because things that were folded carefully lasted longer, and she could not afford to replace what she wore. There were 6 other girls who slept in that attic, and Eliza had learned all their names within a day and made sure none of them learned much of hers beyond it. It was not unkindness, it was habit, worn smooth by 3 years of moving from house to house, position to position, always the newest girl, always the one whose place was least certain. A servant who was liked too well was a servant other servants resented. A servant who was noticed too well by anyone above stairs was a servant who did not stay employed for long, one way or another. So Eliza kept her head down and her voice low and ate her bread at the far end of the kitchen table, and if the other girls thought her cold, she let them think it, because cold, at least, was a thing that could not be taken from her. She had arrived at Ashbourne Hall 3 weeks before, 19 years old, carrying a cracked mirror wrapped in a stocking, a shawl mended so many times it was more mending than shawl, and a single piece of paper with an address written on it in a hand she trusted more than her own. The address belonged to a blacksmith's family 2 counties away, where her younger brother Thomas boarded and learned a trade and ate 3 meals a day because Eliza's wages made it so. She thought of him every morning before she thought of anything else. It was, she had found, the surest way to make her hands move on a morning when the cold in the attic made every other part of her want to stay still. Their mother had died when Thomas was 7 and Eliza was 14, and their father had not been a man anyone could depend upon even while their mother lived, so it had fallen to Eliza, without anyone deciding it should, to become the person Thomas depended upon instead. She had done it without complaint because complaint changed nothing, and Thomas needed a sister who did not look frightened even on the days she was. She wrote to him once a month, letters that cost her a candle stub and an hour she did not properly have, and she signed each one the same way she had signed the first. Your sister, who thinks of you always, and will send for you the moment there is a home worth sending you to. She had been a scullery girl before Ashbourne, and a laundress before that, and in both places she had learned the same lesson twice over, which was that a servant who was noticed was a servant who was measured, and a servant who was measured was a servant who could be found wanting. So she moved through the great house the way she had trained herself to move through every house before it, eyes down, voice low, footsteps soft on stone and marble alike, as though she meant to leave no mark of having passed through a room at all. She scrubbed the flagstones of the lower passage until her knuckles cracked in the cold, and she carried coal scuttles up 3 flights until her arms ached in a way she had stopped noticing months ago, and she counted herself fortunate, because fortunate at Ashbourne meant a dry bed and 2 meals and a roof that did not leak on the girls who slept beneath it. What no one at Ashbourne knew, because no one had ever thought to ask, was that Eliza had a way with words that bordered on a kind of magic. As a girl, she had described the world to her own grandmother, who had lost her sight to a fever the year Eliza turned 12, and she had done it so well that the old woman would laugh until she wept, or fall quiet and still as though she were seeing it after all. Her grandmother used to say that Eliza did not describe a thing so much as she handed it to you, whole, the way you might hand someone a warm loaf straight from the oven, still steaming, so that they could feel the truth of it before they had even understood the words. Eliza still remembered the particular chair her grandmother had sat in every evening after the fever took her sight. A low chair by the hearth with one arm worn smooth from years of a hand resting there, and how the old woman would turn her face toward the fire out of habit, though she could no longer see the flames, only feel their warmth. Eliza would sit at her feet on the cold floor and tell her what the fire looked like that night, whether it burned high and restless or low and steady, whether the smoke curled straight up the chimney or caught in the draft and swirled back into the room, and her grandmother would nod slowly, as though she were watching it after all, and say, "There now, I can see it, child. Go on." It was in that low chair, in those evenings, that Eliza had first understood that a person could be given back a piece of the world through nothing more than careful words, patiently chosen, and that the giving cost the giver very little and meant to the one receiving it nearly everything. Her grandmother had died 2 winters before Eliza came to Ashbourne, quietly, in her sleep, without pain, and Eliza had told herself afterward that the gift had died with her, since there was no one left in her life who needed it, and no household that would think to want it from a girl paid to scrub floors and carry coal. It was, Eliza believed, a small thing, a private thing, the sort of gift that helped no one but a blind old woman in a cottage that no longer existed and could be of no possible use in a duke's household, where what was wanted of her was silence, speed, and invisibility. She had folded that gift away, much like her blanket, and told herself it was a comfort for the dead and not a tool for the living. The house itself seemed to agree with her about silence. There was a hush over Ashbourne that unsettled even the maids who had served there for years, a hush that had begun 3 autumns before Eliza's arrival, on the night the East Conservatory burned. The Dowager Duchess, Margaret, had been inside it when the fire took hold, and she had come out of it alive but blind, her sight taken as completely as if it had never been given to her at all. The conservatory had been built as a wedding gift, a glass garden commissioned by her son, Julian, Duke of Ashbourne, for the wife he married the same year. His wife had not come out of the fire at all. The other maids spoke of it only in whispers, and only when Mrs. Prewitt was safely elsewhere, piecing together what had happened from fragments handed down through years of servants who had themselves only ever had fragments to work with. No one below stairs knew exactly how the fire had started. What they knew, and repeated to each other in low voices over the mending, was that the Duke had not set foot past the conservatory's threshold since, that the gates to that part of the garden had been locked within a week of the fire and had stayed locked ever since, and that any servant unwise enough to mention the conservatory, the fire, or the late Duchess within the old Duchess's hearing was dismissed by nightfall. No exceptions, no appeals. Since that night, Julian had ordered the garden gates locked. He had forbidden any servant from so much as naming the conservatory in his mother's hearing, and he had retreated into a coldness that the staff below stairs called pride, and whispered about as such, though it was not pride at all. It was a grief he had never once let himself carry properly, only set down somewhere out of sight and told himself it was finished with. A man who has buried a wife and taken his own mother's sight from her in the same night, even by an accident no one blamed him for aloud, learns to carry himself very carefully indeed, lest the weight show. Ruling over the servants' hall and ruling over Eliza's first weeks in it was Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper, whose authority was brittle in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with fear. Mrs. Prewitt had once had a name and a household of her own, before her husband's debts took both, and she had learned, in the losing of them, that security was a thin thing, easily spent, and that a woman without a husband or a fortune had only her position to stand on, and a position could be taken from her as swiftly as everything else had been. She watched every new girl who came through Ashbourne's doors the way a woman watches a fire she has been burned by before, not because she wished the girl harm, but because she could not afford this time to be the one left holding the blame for whatever went wrong under her care. Eliza, quiet and quick and unreadable, unsettled her from the first day, precisely because there was nothing in her Mrs. Prewitt could easily read or easily place. It was into this house, this hush, this careful arrangement of fear and grief kept at a polite distance from each other, that the Dowager Duchess's request arrived like a small stone dropped into still water. Margaret, restless in the dark she had lived in for 3 years, restless for a world she could no longer see but had not stopped wanting, asked one afternoon that whichever maid was nearest be sent to read to her. It was Eliza who was nearest. It was Eliza who answered. She had been given only a slim book of sermons to read, dry and dutiful, and she read 3 pages of it before she saw the Duchess's hands go still in her lap, not with peace, but with a kind of patient, well-worn boredom that Eliza recognized because she had seen it in her grandmother's face 100 times. In the years before, she had learned to fill the silence with something better than sermons. So she set the book down, gently, and asked if the Duchess might like to hear about the garden instead. Not the burned one, she was careful to say, only the older grounds, the ones still tended, still growing, just beyond the terrace doors. The Duchess turned her face toward the window she could not see through and said that she would like that very much, and something in her voice, tired and hopeful in equal measure, reminded Eliza so sharply of her grandmother that she nearly lost her nerve before she had begun. She did not merely name what grew there. She had never been able to simply name things. Naming had always felt to her like handing someone an empty box and calling it a gift. She told the Duchess that the roses spilled down the far wall, the color of claret poured into morning light, thick and dark and warm at the edges where the sun had been sitting on them since dawn. She told her that the fountain's water made a sound like her brother's laughter used to make before their mother died, and the laughing in that house went quiet for a long while. She told her that the ivy on the east wall climbed the way something patient and stubborn climbs, not fast, never fast, but always a little higher than it had been the week before, as though it did not know how to stop simply because no one was watching it try. She told her that the gravel path crunched under a boot in a particular way in October, dry and bright, nothing at all like the soft give of it in spring, and that if the Duchess listened carefully on a still afternoon, she might hear the gardener's boy singing to himself 2 beds over, off-key and entirely unashamed of it. The Duchess wept. Not the weeping of grief, though grief was under it somewhere, but the weeping of a woman who has been given back, for 20 minutes, a world she had been told she must live entirely without. She reached out and found Eliza's hand, without needing to be told where it was, and held it, and said only, "Again tomorrow. Will you come again tomorrow?" Eliza said that she would, and found to her own surprise that she meant it far past the point of duty. She asked for Eliza again the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that. Within a week it was understood, without ever being announced, that the reading hour belonged to Eliza now, and Eliza alone, and that the Duchess would accept no substitute, a fact that made Mrs. Prewitt's mouth go thin every time it was mentioned, though she said nothing of it yet. What Eliza did not know, what she could not have known because he was careful, and because careful was the only way he did anything anymore, was that the Duke had taken to standing just beyond the doorway during those hours. He had not meant to the first time. He had been passing on his way to the study, and he had heard, through the half-open door, his mother laugh. Not the small, courteous laugh she gave at dinner, when a guest said something clever. A real laugh, unguarded, rising and falling the way it used to before the fire, before the world had narrowed itself down to a house she could no longer see, and a son who could not find the words to sit beside her in the dark of it. He had stopped walking. He had stood there, out of sight, and listened until the laugh faded into quiet, and then he had gone on to his study, and sat at his desk for a long while, without opening a single letter, staring instead at the middle distance the way a man stares when he is listening to something inside himself rather than in the room. He came back the next day, and the day after. He told himself, each time, that he was only passing, only checking that his mother was not being troubled, only making sure the new girl was suitable for the position she had somehow acquired without his knowledge or consent. He did not examine too closely why passing required him to stand still for 20 minutes with his hand on the doorframe, listening to a maid describe a garden he had not walked through in 3 years. He had trusted a kind of tenderness once before, in the last months of his marriage, and had learned too late that some tenderness is only ever a performance given for an audience that is meant to be grateful for it. His late wife had been charming in company and colder in private than anyone below stairs ever guessed, and he had spent the better part of 2 years mistaking the charm for the whole truth of her, until grief and its aftermath had shown him otherwise, whether he wished to see it or not. He had buried her believing he had failed to know his own wife. He was not eager to be made a fool of twice by a face that knew how to arrange itself prettily for whoever was watching. So he watched and said nothing and told no one, and let the days pass while he tried to determine, quietly, privately, the way he did everything now, whether what he was hearing through that door was real, or only another performance he had not yet learned to see through. The first time Julian and Eliza spoke to each other directly, it was not in the Eastern Hall at all, but in the long gallery, on an afternoon when he had come home earlier than expected and found her on her knees at the base of the third window, scrubbing at a stain some careless footman had left weeks before, and no one had troubled to see to since. She heard his step before she saw him, and rose at once, smoothing her apron, eyes down, the posture that had kept her safe in 3 households before this one. He had meant to walk past her without a word, as he walked past most of the staff most days, his mind already 3 rooms ahead on some estate matter or other. But he found himself stopping instead, and asking, in a voice that came out more abrupt than he intended, whether she was the girl who read to his mother. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, and nothing more, because volunteering more than was asked was a habit that had gotten girls dismissed in houses less patient than this one might prove to be. He looked at her a moment longer than the question required. She did not fidget under it, which he noted, nor did she offer him the small, ingratiating smile that most of the staff produced automatically when the Duke's attention landed on them. She simply waited, hands folded, to be told whether she might return to her work. "She has not laughed like that in 3 years," he said finally, and it was not a question, though it hung in the air like one. Eliza considered her answer carefully, because she had learned that the wrong answer, however true, could cost a great deal. "I only tell her what is in the garden, Your Grace," she said. "The rest is her own doing." "Is it?" he said, in a tone she could not read at all, and then he continued on down the gallery without another word, leaving her to wonder for the rest of the afternoon whether she had said something wrong, or whether, for reasons she could not name, she had said something that had landed closer to right than she knew. He thought of that exchange for longer than he would have liked to admit. There had been no flattery in it, no performance, only a plain answer, given plainly, by a girl who did not appear to want anything from him beyond permission to return to her work. It unsettled him more than charm would have, because he had no ready defense against it. Mrs. Prewitt, sensing the Duke's unexplained visits to the Eastern Hall, and now, worse, an exchange in the long gallery that 3 separate footmen had somehow all managed to witness and repeat, mistook affection for impropriety, as fear tends to mistake most things it cannot control for the worst version of themselves. She called Eliza to her small office off the kitchen passage one evening and told her, in a voice pitched low enough that no one else would hear it, that she had better stop putting on airs for the family, that a maid who caught the master's eye caught nothing but trouble sooner or later, and that she would find herself dismissed without a reference before the week was out if the visits to the Eastern Hall did not stop drawing the sort of attention they had begun to draw. Eliza did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with someone who held your wages in their hand accomplished nothing but the confirmation of whatever they already believed of you. But she walked back to the attic that evening with her stomach in a tight, cold knot, because a dismissal without reference was not merely the loss of a position. It was the loss of Thomas's keep. It was the blacksmith's family deciding, kindly but firmly, that a boy whose sister could no longer pay for him was a boy they could no longer keep, and Thomas finding himself, at 12 years old, exactly where Eliza had spent every waking hour of the last 3 years working to make sure he never had to be, with nowhere certain to go, and no one certain to want him there. She lay awake a long while that night thinking of her brother's face, and of the word reference, and of how thin the ground beneath her feet had always been, in every house she had ever worked in, no matter how carefully she scrubbed or how softly she walked. She thought, too, of the Duchess's hand finding hers without needing to be told where it was, and of how the old woman's face had looked that first afternoon, turned toward a window she could not see through as though she could feel the light on it anyway. She did not stop reading to the Duchess. She could not have explained why, except that stopping would have meant lying to a blind old woman about why the visits had ended. And Eliza found she could not do that either. So she went on, more carefully than before, arriving a few minutes later than usual and leaving a few minutes earlier, as though a shorter visit might draw less notice than a long one, and told herself that careful, like folded blankets, made things last longer. The weeks that followed carried their own quiet tension. Julian found reasons to be near the Eastern Hall at the hour of the reading more often than any estate business could reasonably account for, and told himself each time that it was his mother's welfare he came to check on, though he had stopped believing that excuse somewhere around the second week without quite admitting it to himself. He watched, from just beyond the doorway, the way Eliza's voice changed when she described something she loved, a warmth entering it that was entirely absent from the flat, careful tone she used with the rest of the household. And he began, slowly, testing without meaning to wonder whether a woman capable of that kind of warmth in private could truly be capable of the calculation Mrs. Prewitt seemed so certain lay beneath it. He did not trust the wondering. He had trusted wondering like it once before, and it had cost him more than he cared to remember on a bad night. But he kept coming back to the doorway all the same, because the sound of his mother laughing had become, without his quite choosing it, the one part of his day he found himself waiting for. Once, wanting to test something in himself he did not care to name even privately, he arranged to be seated near enough to overhear Eliza at her ordinary work below stairs, where she had no notion he was near and no reason to arrange her voice for anyone's benefit. He heard her correct a younger girl's clumsy folding of linens without a trace of unkindness in it, only patience, the same patience he had heard her use with his mother, and he heard her turn down, quite firmly, a footman's offer to walk her to market of a Sunday, with a plainness that left no room for argument and no cruelty in the refusing either. There was, he found, no second voice in her. The gentleness he heard through the doorway of the eastern hall was not a mask put on for an audience of two. It was simply how she was, tested or untested, watched or unwatched, and the discovery unsettled him more than any deception could have, because it left him with no reason left to distrust her, and distrust by then had become a habit nearly as old as his grief. He said nothing of any of this to her. He was not, even by then, a man given to saying such things aloud before he was certain of them. But he found himself, in the weeks that followed, arranging small kindnesses toward her that he was careful to make appear as though they belonged to someone else's decision, an extra half-day given to the household generally rather than to her alone, a warmer coal ration for the attic rooms that he blamed when Mrs. Prewitt questioned it, on the season rather than on any particular girl who slept beneath that roof. He told himself it was fairness, owed to any servant who served his mother so faithfully. He did not examine, any more than he had to, why fairness so consistently seemed to arrange itself around one servant in particular. It was the Duchess herself who broke the careful quiet, as the Duchess was the only person in that house with nothing left to fear from anyone. Some weeks into the reading hours, emboldened by claret-colored roses and fountains that sounded like old laughter, Margaret asked to be led to the conservatory itself, not the garden beyond it, the conservatory, the glass room that had taken her sight and her daughter-in-law both, and had stood locked and silent for 3 years while her son pretended it did not exist. Eliza's hands had gone cold at the request, but she had answered honestly, as she answered everything. She told the Duchess that the doors were locked and that she did not have a key and that she did not think it was her place to ask for one. The Duchess had gone quiet at that, quiet in a different way than her usual listening quiet, and had asked, in a voice gone suddenly small, whether Eliza thought her son would ever open those doors again in her lifetime. Eliza had not known how to answer that honestly without causing pain, so she had said only that some doors take longer to open than others, and that she did not think the waiting meant the door was forgotten. It was enough. It was more than enough for Mrs. Prewitt, who heard of the request within the hour from a footman who had overheard it, and who chose, unwisely as it turned out, to raise the matter not privately but at the worst possible moment. During a small supper, the Duke had arranged that same evening for 2 neighboring families, the kind of quiet gathering meant to remind the county that Ashbourne, after 3 years of mourning, was beginning to open its doors again. The Dowager Duchess had asked to be brought down for the evening, a request that had not been made in longer than anyone below stairs could remember, and Eliza had been asked to attend her at table, seated near enough to describe a dish or a face when Margaret wished it, a small kindness Julian had arranged without making any great show of arranging it. It should have been by every measure a good evening. It became, instead, the evening the whole house nearly came apart. Mrs. Prewitt, standing near the sideboard where she had no true reason to linger, chose a lull in the conversation to address the table directly, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry the length of it. She said she thought it only right that the family know what had lately been asked of the poor blind Duchess by a servant with ideas above her station, that the new housemaid had been putting notions of the burned conservatory into her Grace's head, stirring up grief no one had sanctioned, and that she, as housekeeper, felt it her duty to speak plainly where others might stay silent out of misplaced sentiment. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses it has just been handed something it was not meant to overhear. One of the visiting ladies set down her fork. Julian's jaw went tight, a stillness settling over him that anyone who had known him before the fire would have recognized as the look he wore just before he said something he could not take back. It was the Duchess who spoke first, before her son could. She set her hand flat on the table, not loudly, but with a firmness that silenced the room more completely than any raised voice could have. She said that she had asked to see the conservatory herself, of her own will and no one else's, and that the girl beside her had told her plainly she did not have the key and did not think it her place to ask for one. Words the Duchess repeated now at that table, in front of guests who had come expecting nothing more than a pleasant supper, because she would not sit quietly while a servant was blamed for her own asking. Mrs. Prewitt, caught between the Duchess's account and her own, tried to recover the ground she had lost, suggesting that perhaps the Duchess had been led gently toward the asking, that a girl clever enough to describe a garden so vividly was clever enough to plant an idea without ever seeming to. It was not a large step from there to accusation, and the visiting families, sensing scandal where they had come for supper, leaned into the silence to hear how it would resolve. Eliza did not lower her eyes as she had trained herself to do in every house she had ever served in. She looked instead at the Duchess beside her, and then, briefly, at Julian at the head of the table, and said, in a voice that shook only slightly, that she would answer whatever the Duke wished to ask her, in front of whomever he wished her to answer it, but that she would not sit and be called a schemer at a table she had been invited to only to serve, while the truth of the matter sat 2 feet away from her in the person of the woman she had spent 2 months reading to. Julian rose from his chair. It was, in itself, enough to end the conversation, since no one at that table was inclined to speak over a standing duke. He said, in a voice gone very quiet and very even, that the matter would be discussed properly and privately, as it ought to have been discussed from the start, and that he would thank Mrs. Prewitt for raising it at his table in front of guests rather less than he thanked her for raising it at all. He did not dismiss Eliza on the spot, as half the room seemed to expect him to, and the visiting families left that evening with a great deal more to speak of on their carriage ride home than they had arrived with, which was, for Ashbourne's reputation, very nearly the worst outcome the evening could have produced short of an outright scandal. Julian did not dismiss her that hour, either, though the temptation to end the matter quickly and cleanly, in the way that would cause the least talk in the county, must have crossed his mind more than once in the hours that followed. But something in him went cold and still, in a way it had not been since the fire itself, and he sent for Eliza at once, before he had fully decided what he meant to say to her. Eliza came to the study expecting evasion to be the wisest course, and finding, when she stood in front of him, that she could not manage it. She had never learned to lie well, only to say little, and little was not going to serve her now, not with his eyes on her the way they were, waiting for the performance Mrs. Prewitt had promised him he would find. So, when he asked her, in a voice carefully stripped of anything she could read, whether she had told his mother of the conservatory, whether she had put ideas of that burned room into a blind woman's head for reasons of her own, she told him the truth. She told him she had never once described the conservatory to the Duchess. Not the fire, not the glass, not what had been lost in it. She had only ever described the garden beyond it, the safe garden, the one still growing because, and here her voice did not waver, though she felt it might, because she had guessed, without being told anything at all, that some rooms carried a kind of grief too heavy to be handed to someone in words, least of all, by a servant who had no right to decide when another person was ready to bear it. She said that if he believed she had gone looking for ways to distress his mother, he was welcome to ask the Duchess herself what had passed between them these past weeks, because she had nothing said in that room she was ashamed to have repeated in front of him. She did not plead. She did not explain herself past what the truth required, though every instinct she had spent 3 years sharpening told her to soften the words, to add something pleading at the edges the way a frightened servant was supposed to. She said what was true, plainly, the way a person says something they are prepared to be dismissed for saying. And then she stood and waited, hands folded, for whatever came next. Julian looked at her for a long moment, that felt, to both of them, considerably longer than it was. The fire in the study grate had burned low, and neither of them moved to tend it, as though tending it might break whatever fragile thing was happening in the silence between them. Something in the room seemed to loosen, the way a held breath loosens when it is finally let go. He had expected performance. He had expected the careful, tearful denial he had heard from a dozen servants over the years, the kind that told you more about a person's skill at pleading than about the truth of anything. He had gotten only a young woman with tired eyes and steady hands, telling him a truth that cost her something to tell, and asking nothing from him in return for it. No reference, no leniency, no assurance that she would keep her place. Only the plain fact of what had and had not happened between herself and his mother, offered up and then left to stand or fall on its own. "You might have told her something to please her," he said at last, testing the words as he spoke them. "Every servant learns to please. It costs nothing and it keeps a position." "It would have cost her the truth," Eliza said. "I did not think that was mine to spend." He had no answer ready for that, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want one. He did not say very much to her that evening, only that she was dismissed to her supper, and that nothing further would be decided that night. But that same night, for the first time in 3 years, he went to his mother's rooms and asked her, plainly, what she remembered of the fire. He had never asked before. He had spent 3 years believing that asking would break something in her that could not be mended, and in avoiding the question he had only ever succeeded in breaking something in himself instead. Some part of him that had grown so used to carrying the weight silently that he had forgotten it was possible to set part of it down. His mother told him. She told him slowly, in her own time, with Eliza sitting quietly beside her chair because the Duchess had asked for her to stay, translating the silences between them into something neither the mother nor the son had been able to say aloud to each other in 3 years. She told him of the moment the smoke had first reached her, and of how she had thought, in that instant, not of herself, but of the young woman across the room from her, his wife, and of how she had called out and gotten no answer, and of the guilt she had carried since for having survived a fire that had taken someone else's life, and left her only her sight in payment. Julian wept that night, in the small parlor off his mother's rooms, for the first time since the fire. He wept for his wife, and for his mother's sight, and for 3 years spent locking a door instead of grieving what was behind it, and he did not try to hide any of it from the 2 women in the room, because he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not want to. Eliza rose to leave them their privacy, but the Duchess reached out and asked her to stay a moment longer, and so she remained, quiet in the corner of the room, until the worst of it had passed, and the Duke had gathered himself enough to thank her, in a voice still rough, for something he did not quite have the words to name. The accusation against Eliza was quietly looked into in the days that followed, and just as quietly disproven, the Duchess herself confirming to her son, in no uncertain terms, exactly what had and had not been said in that room across the weeks of their reading hours. The Duke did not ruin Mrs. Prewitt for it, though he might have, and though a lesser man in his position would have counted himself entitled to make an example of her. He called her to his study instead and told her plainly what the inquiry had found, and watched her face go through fear and then something closer to shame, and understood, in the end, that her fear had made her cruel, not her nature, and that there was a difference worth honoring even in punishment. He removed her from authority over the younger staff, and he arranged a modest pension for her at a smaller property in the north, enough to spare her the poverty she had spent her whole life dreading, even as he ended the harm that dread had caused under his own roof. Mrs. Prewitt left Ashbourne within the month, and if she was not grateful for the manner of her going, she was at least honest enough with herself to know it had been more mercy than she had shown the girl she'd tried to have dismissed. The conservatory gates were opened again the following spring. They were not opened as a shrine to what had been lost in them. Julian would not permit that, and Eliza, when he asked her opinion of it one afternoon as they stood together at the locked gate for the first time, told him plainly that a garden kept as a monument to grief was no garden at all, only a grave with better light, and that if he meant to honor his wife and the fire that took her, he would do better to grow something in that room than to leave it empty and dark as a warning to himself. He had looked at her for a long moment after she said it, the way he had looked at her in his study months before, and then he had asked in a voice gone quiet whether she would help him plant it. She had not expected the question and had told him honestly that she was a housemaid and not a gardener, that she knew flowers only well enough to describe them to a woman who could not see them, not well enough to grow them herself. He had said that describing them well enough to make his mother weep with joy seemed to him a rarer gift than knowing the right season to plant a rose, and that he would take her word over any gardener's on what that room ought to look like when it was finished. So it was replanted under Eliza's direction at Julian's request, with a bed of claret-colored roses at its center, exactly the color she had once described through a locked door to a woman who could not see them. Julian worked alongside the gardeners himself some afternoons, his coat off and his sleeves rolled in a way no one at Ashbourne had ever seen the Duke work at anything before, and the staff below stairs began, slowly, to speak of the conservatory not as the burned room anymore, but as the new garden, which was its own kind of small miracle in a house that had spent 3 years refusing to speak of it at all. It was in that half-finished garden, on a mild afternoon in early spring with the new roses not yet in their first bloom, that Julian asked Eliza to marry him. He did not do it grandly. He was not, he told her, a man who had much practice at grand gestures, and he did not think she was a woman who wanted one. He told her instead, plainly, the way she had always spoken to him, that he had come to depend on her honesty more than he had ever depended on anyone's, that his mother had not merely regained a garden in the past year, but had regained a daughter in every way but the paperwork of it, and that he did not think he wanted to spend the rest of his life pretending that what he felt for Eliza was gratitude alone, when gratitude had very little to do with why he found himself looking for her before he had even decided to. Eliza, who had spent 3 years training herself never to want anything above her station, found that she could not manage her usual careful silence in the face of it. She told him, with the same plainness she had used in his study months before, that she had nothing to bring to such a marriage. No dowry, no family name worth mentioning, only a brother 2 counties away and a gift for description that had once seemed useful for nothing but comforting a blind old woman. Julian told her that he had a house full of things, and had been for 3 years entirely unable to describe a single one of them to himself in any way that mattered, and that he would rather have her honesty than another woman's fortune if she would have him. She said yes, and Thomas, sent for within the month, arrived at Ashbourne not as a boy boarding on his sister's wages, but as the brother of its future duchess, a change so large he could not, for the first week, quite believe it was permanent. A year after the wedding, Eliza stood in that same garden as Duchess of Ashbourne, the roses grown full and heavy now, exactly the claret she had promised the Duchess they would be. She still described them aloud most evenings, though her mother-in-law's blindness no longer made the describing a necessity. The old woman had, by then, learned every inch of that garden by hand and memory, could walk its paths herself, with only a light touch on Eliza's arm for guidance. Thomas had grown a full head taller in the year since he'd come to live at Ashbourne, and had taken to everyone's quiet amusement. To spending his afternoons with the head gardener rather than with any tutor, Julian tried to arrange for him, learning the names of things that grew the way his sister had once learned to describe them. He had planted, without asking anyone's permission, a small bed of his own near the conservatory wall. Nothing grand, only a few hardy things that did not mind an inexperienced hand, and he told his sister once, with the particular seriousness of a boy of 13, that he liked growing things because you could watch them get better instead of only watch them get taken away. Eliza had not trusted herself to answer him properly that day, and had only put her arm around his shoulders and let the silence say what she could not. Julian had taken to walking the garden most mornings before the house was fully awake, alone at first out of old habit, and then, more often than not, with his wife beside him, the two of them saying very little, since there was very little left between them that needed saying aloud to be understood. He had commissioned that spring a small stained glass pane for the conservatory roof, set directly above the claret roses, so that on clear mornings the light fell through it, colored exactly the shade Eliza had once described through a locked door, not as a memorial to what the room had once been, but as a kind of answer to it, proof that a room could hold both what was lost and what had grown since, without either one having to make room for the other by force. It had become, by then, something else entirely, a small ritual the three of them kept, without ever having agreed to keep it, a way of saying, without quite saying it, that they were still there, still together, still glad, after everything the fire had taken and everything the years since had slowly given back, to be alive, and to be in that garden, and to have found, each of them, someone willing to listen when they finally had something to say. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.